Welcome to today's teaching. Last week I was speaking to you on the subject of obedience, and today I'm going to finish up what I really started last week and then move into the subject of humility, because obedience and humility are two things that go together. You know, if we choose to obey somebody, just in a natural way, if we choose to obey, it's really to yield our will to do something that we don't always want to do. And so there's a yieldedness that goes along with obedience, and yieldedness comes from humility. So I just want to finish up what I started last week in teaching you about obedience. Because I've been speaking about the fact that in Genesis 18, when God and two angels came as three men, that was the way in which they entered into the place where Abraham lived. We need to remember that the New Testament tells us that we are to be hospitable. And it says in doing that, some of us have entertained angels unawares. In other words, we've entertained angels without even knowing that they're angels. So that means that they come in such human likeness that we have no idea that they are more than human. And so this happened with Abraham, and you can read about it in Genesis 18. The way in which Abraham saw these three men, and so he quickly ran and spoke to Sarah, and they got a meal together, and Abraham stood near them while they ate. And that was when God said to Abraham, this time next year, you're going to have a son, and it's going to be through Sarai, but she's going to be called Sarah from now on. And she heard and she laughed, and God said, why did she laugh? And she said, I didn't laugh. It's amazing. The instinct in the human race is to just immediately lie. You know, I didn't do it, when of course you did. Even my dogs, you know, I've got two avo trees, and they're these little avos that drop onto the ground, and they go out and the avos drop into the bushes, and they'll go into the bushes and secretly eat an avo, which they know they're not allowed to do. And they come back and they look all innocent, and there's green all around their little doggy mouths. And it's amazing that in the human race, you know, if we had avo around our mouths every time we sinned, our faces might be green. But anyhow, getting back to what I was saying, she said, you know, no, I didn't laugh. And God said, no, you did. And they actually gave the child the name Isaac, which means laughter. And a merry heart does good like medicine. So God loves laughter. And the joy of the Lord is our strength. So just remember that joy, laughter, all those things are part of the gifts God gives to us. Anyhow, it was this particular point that I made just at the end of last week. It says in verse 16 of Genesis 18, when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Have you ever gotten to a car to leave somewhere, or even just to walk to where you're going, and your host just walks with you, and the farewells can turn into a 20-minute long farewell? And I'm somebody who likes to move from A to B in a straight line. And so it's like when I say goodbye, I want to get in my car and go. Or I want to walk to where I'm going, you know, not have a long conversation. But I see here that God and Abraham did that. You know, Abraham walked with them on their way. Who knows how long he would have walked. But anyhow, Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And the answer to that question is something that I had not seen until the previous weekend. I'd always skipped over the next verse or couple of verses, and I'd gone straight on to the outcry that rose up against Sodom and Gomorrah. And I thought God wasn't going to hide from Abraham the fact that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, giving Abraham an opportunity to intercede. But you know, if we read straight on, it says this, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And he doesn't mention Sodom. He says, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, and by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he's promised him. And you know, last time, and I'm just going to repeat it now, I spoke about Adam being the first Adam, and Jesus being the last Adam, not the second Adam. And what happened when Adam was alive was that he lived so long, I think it's 930 years, but he lived so long that he was alive while his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and his great-great-grandchildren were alive. And one would have imagined, or rather I would have imagined, that Abraham would have spoken to all of these descendants, or all within reach, and said to them, I was the first man created, and I sinned, and that's why sin is in the human race, and you need to be obedient to God. I wasn't obedient, and that's why we were cast out of the Garden of Eden. And I would have imagined that Adam would have made obedience to God the most crucial thing that anybody could do, but he obviously didn't do that. Because when the flood came, it was because their sin was so rampant in the human race that when God said that only Noah and his family would be saved, because Noah was the only righteous man on earth, and so they were brought into the ark. And God promised never again to bring a flood on the earth. Instead, the present heavens and earth, are reserved for judgment by fire. So he'll never flood the earth again. However, when he started again with Abraham, because, after Noah and his sons land, when the ark finally came onto dry land, a whole new group of people were birthed and populated the earth. But it was only when God finds Abraham, and we know that he's a man of faith. But what we don't realize is that he's also a man of implicit obedience. He's going to obey God in absolutely everything. And we see that when we come to his son Isaac. So he was chosen because God was actually saying, you're not going to be like Adam. You're like 4 generations on. Where are these people? But with Abraham, it was going to be 430 years that his descendants lived in Egypt. And it was going to be in several generations' time that they go down to Egypt when there was a famine, and when Joseph became prime minister of Egypt. So that was several generations ahead. But then even after Joseph died, and they stayed in Egypt and they multiplied, it said there was a Pharaoh that didn't know anything about Joseph. He just saw that there was this other group of people living among his people, and that they just seemed to multiply. And there were probably more Israelites, one of the books I read said, more Israelites than there were Egyptians. And so they became something that Pharaoh was afraid of, and that was why he enslaved them. But what God said to Abraham here is, you are going to teach and direct your household. You're going to train them so that I'm going to make you a great and powerful nation. And he told him, I think in chapter 15, when he made the covenant and Abraham had to chase the vultures away, when they came to try and take the meat of the sacrifices, that he said to Abraham then, your descendants are going to go into captivity. But now here, he's really emphasizing the fact to Abraham that that the call on his life is not just to have faith in him, but to teach his children to have faith in him, teach his household to have faith in him. And in that faith, part of faith is obedience. And so that was why he was chosen. And that was just amazing to me. And it was going to be down the line that the children of Israel had to finally go into Canaan. But in order to do that, there had to be obedience. And if we just skip several generations and skip into the time of Moses, we realize that first generation that went into the wilderness did not obey. They saw the giants. They said, we're grasshoppers. We're grasshoppers in our own sight, and we're grasshoppers in their sight. And they would not obey, even though Joshua and Caleb tore their robes, and they said, we're well able to go in. That generation, only 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, survived to go into the promised land. Another generation had to be brought up. And if there weren't people there to say, no, we have to obey God, what would have happened to Israel? They might have just disappeared like every other nation, been absorbed among the Canaanites. But instead, Joshua became the man who would lead them into the promised land. And Joshua was one of the 2 spies who had spied out the land and had brought a report and spoke about it in faith. So God has always had to have leaders who speak in faith and encourage people to obedience, because obedience is better than sacrifice. You know, if you are a business person and you make loads of money and you give most of your money to the kingdom of God, it doesn't mean that that is really acceptable to God if in every other way you are disobeying him. You know, you might be obedient in the matter of finance and disobedient in the area of relationships. God specifically says obedience is better than sacrifice. He said to obey is better than the blood of bulls and rams. So obedience is what we're talking about here. So now if we go on to Genesis 22, we see here, this is where God calls on Abraham and says to him, now I want you to take your son Isaac. You know, he talks about him as his only son. He's the only son of promise. The others that he had Ishmael with Hagar as the mother, and then after Sarah's death, he married Keturah and had more sons, 6 more sons. And so when he talks about Isaac being the only son, he's the only son of promise. So he said, I want you to take him, and I want you to go to this place, and I want you to sacrifice him and to a mountain. So I don't know if Abraham told Sarah. I should imagine not. I mean, he might have said, we're going to go to Mount Horeb and we're going to go and worship there. But I doubt very much that he would have said to Sarah, I'm actually off to kill your son. So anyway, off they went, and it was a 3-day journey. And we know these stories so well, if we are Christians. And so off they went to Mount Horeb. And when it came into sight, it was a journey of 3 days to get to Mount Horeb. And when it came into sight, Abraham saw it in the front, and he knew that was where his son was going to die. But he said to the servants, stay here. The lad and I, or the boy and I, are going to go, and we're going to worship, and we're going to come back to you. And so that was a faith statement. Both of us are going, and both of us are coming back. And on the way, Isaac said to him, Father, I see that we've got the wood for the fire, but where's the ram for the burnt offering? And Abraham said to him, my son, God himself will provide for the offering. And of course, he went up, and I wonder what he was thinking of as a father during that 3-day journey. One thing I do know is that he was prepared to be obedient to God, no matter what it cost him. But now I want to look at Isaac, because if you think of this, by this time, scholars don't know whether how old Isaac was at the time. But just let's imagine that he was a teenager, because they called them lads and boys, even when they were up to 14 or at least up to 17 years of age. So just imagine he was around 14 to 16. By that time, Abraham was around 114 or 116. So he was an old man and presumably not nearly as strong as his son. And so when they got to the top, imagine the scene. Abraham actually, it says he tied Isaac up and put him on the altar. Do you realize that Isaac could have fought? He could have fought and in all probability overpowered his father, because he was a young, strong person and Abraham was an old man. But nevertheless, there had to be something in Isaac that was prepared to be obedient to his father, because obedience was something that he was trained in, obedience to God and obedience to his parents. So when Abraham said to him, son, I'm going to have to tie you up, he had to yield to that. He had to allow his father to go around and bind him and put him, probably he had to climb up onto the altar himself and lie down. And this is one thing about sacrifices, is that usually they're dead. And in order to get up and be a sacrifice ourselves, as a live sacrifice, we have got to act as if we're dead. We've got to lie down and not move. And that was required of this youngster. He had to get up onto that altar, having been bound by his father, lie down and wait for death. And Abraham had to see the knife or the dagger in Abraham's hand. He had to watch his father getting ready to make the sacrifice. And Abraham had actually lifted the knife and was about to strike his son and kill him when the angel said, stop. And God said to him, now I know that you won't withhold from me your only son. And he stopped him at that point. And then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And he took the ram and he sacrificed it instead. But if we read on, it says, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashores. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Just think of those words, because you have obeyed me. It's really 5 words. Don't know how many in the Hebrew. But in any case, all of this happened, and we look at Abraham's faith, but I really think that we've got to look at Isaac's obedience. You know, Abraham was prepared to obey God and do this in faith, knowing, and it says in the letter to the Hebrews, that he knew, he had faith that God would raise his son from the dead. And so obviously his faith was in God. But what about Isaac? I mean, Isaac hadn't had the same experiences with God that Abraham had had. It was purely obedience in his father. There had to be an element of faith in it, but basically it was obedience that caused him to do that. It was the one man that had the faith that even if he killed his son, God would raise him from the dead. But I doubt if Isaac had that same faith. He was just prepared to die. And the thing is, this is the reason that God was able to make that covenant with Abraham, because he was going to send his own son, Jesus, and he was going to go to the cross, and he was going to die for all of us. And we've celebrated Easter in the past month. But when you think about this, it was because Isaac yielded, he became obedient, but there also had to be something within him that was prepared to do this. And we aren't told anywhere in the Bible that Isaac had faith that he would be raised from the dead. So that makes his obedience to me even more precious, because he went that altar thinking, well, if I die, I die. Like Esther when she went before the king and she said, if I perish, I perish. And there has to be something in us that is like that attitude which I read last week, Philippians 2. God bless you, and I hope that you received and were blessed by that.